secret is I just smile and say, follow me. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Life's too short not to really live. I got a big heart, I can let you in. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. On top of the world. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. On top of the world. People ask me what my secret is. I just smile and say, live for today. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the sun came up and I gotta say, see it in a whole new way. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah. On top of the world. Yeah. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah. On top of the world. Yeah. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. People ask me what my secret is. On top of the world. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Ask me what my secret is. On top of the world. I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah, I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sitting on top of the world, on top of the world.
Hello world, wake me up to another good morning, time to go. Got that smile upon my face, cause there's excitement in the chase, this I know. Yeah, I'm going for the ride and find myself, I am alive, and I soar. Still I run towards the wind and let the challenge draw me in, cause I want more. Oh, we are all looking for adventure. We are all looking for get up and go. There is joy found in the race, and I feel it in the place where I'm free. And I simply can't deny it, that I feel adventure calling out to me. Yeah, we are all looking for adventure. 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 We are all looking for And I'm living free, living free, living free, and I was meant to be. Living free, living free, living free, and I was meant to be. I'm living free, living free, living free, and I was meant to be free. Meant to be free.
Ayan nga, isang makakalikasang hapon sa ating lahat at welcome sa ikalawang episode ng ating weekly webcast na entitled Klimatotohanan. This weekly webcast is a project of the Climate Reality Project Philippines kung saan tatalakayin natin ang mga issue at katanungan surrounding the climate crisis kasama ng ating mga panauhing eksperto, mga advocates at syempre mga kasamahan nating Pinoy climate reality leaders bawat Sabado, Linggo-linggo. Ako po si Keith Sigfred, isang Pinoy climate reality leader at magiging host ninyo for today's episode. Kasama ko this afternoon is none other than another Pinoy climate reality leader dedicated on her advocacy, Miss Angeli Reyes. Hello Angeli, kamusta?
Hi, Keith. Good afternoon. And to everyone joining us on Facebook Live, thank you for joining us today. So, I'm Angeli Reyes, and I'm super excited for the second episode of Klimatotohanan and to be your co host for today. So, Keith, before we dive into today's episode, can you give us a brief recap on last week's episode?
Sure, Angeli. Last week, we launched the pilot episode of Klimatotohanan, and we are very thankful to those who attended via Facebook Live and via Zoom Room. And also, thank you very much sa ating mga speakers last week. So last week, we had a conversation about resiliency kasi for the past 6 we have been seeing this issue on climate resiliency, on Filipino resiliency, on glorifying Filipino resiliency pop up. So napakinggan natin ang story ni Miss Yasi Gani ng kanyang ikwento ang kanyang experience nung hinagupit ang kanilang lugar ng Yolanda noong 2013. Naibahagi rin niya kung paano siya nag-move forward from that, now helping the Filipino community and the Filipinos in general to become more climate resilient. Nasaksihan din natin ang discussion of Ms. Lou Tibig, a member of the National Panel of Technical Experts and the lead author of the IPCC, sa kanyang discussion kung bakit natin kailangang mas maging climate resilient pa, or why do we need to push for more policies on climate resiliency. And she also stated the need for more climate studies in climate science kasi may bottleneck nga ng studies on climate sciences, particularly in our region. Lastly, we also had a discussion with Ms. Jack Beresila kung saan nagbigay siya ng very comprehensive definition of resiliency and discussed the different climate policies that we have and how to move forward from this from the national level to the local government levels. So Angeli, this episode tungkol saan naman?
Thanks, Keith. So, the theme for this episode is very relevant because this 2020, all parties of the Paris Climate Agreement need to submit their nationally determined contributions. But sadly, not a lot of them have submitted their NDCs to the UNFCCC. But so for this episode, we're going to tackle some questions like what are these NDCs and how can these NDCs address global warming and climate change? And how can the Philippine NDCs lead us towards genuine and lasting resilience? So as we explore these questions with our experts in the field, we hope that you can stay tuned and watch with us and learn with us.
Indeed, Angeli. And reminding again our co-Filipino climate reality leaders. That this project is a project of the the Philippine Climate Reality Project branch, and also of the Filipino Climate Reality Leaders. So we are inviting everyone. Sa mga kasamahan po namin na Pinoy Climate Reality Leaders, we are inviting you to join us in the production team and helping produce and continue this weekly webcast, Klima Totohanan. Share this webcast on your Facebook page, invite your friends, families, and colleagues, and invite them to join us in this climate conversation, which is very relevant. Use our hashtags, hashtag Klimatotohanan, hashtag BetterNDC2020, hashtag Ask the Experts, and hashtag Lead on Climate. So I think our viewers are now excited on learning who our guests for today are. So let's introduce them.
So our first speaker is Miss Padmapani Perez. So she's an anthropologist by training and a writer by heart. She has a very rich list of credentials, but when we asked her how she wanted to be introduced, she said that the most important thing about her is that she's a mother of two and the project lead for Agam Agenda, ICSC. Good afternoon, Miss Padma, and thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Hi everyone, magandang gabi. It's my pleasure to be with you and among my fellow climate reality leaders this evening. Thanks for having me.
Thank you po, Ms. Padma. I'm excited to hear the Agam agenda later. Now, let's introduce the second speaker, Mr. Reginald Rex Barrer. Sir Rex is a Pinoy climate reality leader and the head of climate governance of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Aside from that, he is also a faculty member of the Ateneo School of Government, and that's not it. Aside from that, he is also a frustrated ukulele player just like me. Hello, Sir Rex. Welcome to Klimatotohanan.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Looking forward to discussion this afternoon.
So last but not the least, our other speaker is former Dean Tony Lavinia. He's currently the acting executive director of the Middle Observatory. He's a professor of law, governance, and philosophy. He's a veteran of climate negotiations because he has over 30 years of experience in that field. Aside from that, he's also an advocate of climate justice. So he's not here with us at the moment, but he will join us later for his segment.
So yeah, those are our speakers this afternoon. I think excited na nating mga viewers to listen to the discussion that we will have in this episode 2 of Klimatotohanan. So let's start. Tara, Angeli.
Yeah, so let's head on to the climate activism part of our episode. Joining us is Ms. Padmapani Perez, a Pinoy climate leader and the project lead of Agam Agenda. Hi, Ms. Padma.
Hi again.
So before anything else, what is the role of art in climate activism, or what we call artivism, and how can art be used in pushing forward our advocacies?
Okay, I think art is important because it has the power to move us in ways that science and policy cannot. Art gets to something more primal and deeper within our being. So the science is important, certainly the policy important, but art has a role as well in helping us feel that this is something we can speak about, this is something we can express our thoughts about. It's not just something for specialists and for experts, it concerns all of us. And art is a way for widening the space for many different people to talk about the climate crisis.
Thank you for that, ma'am. Actually, I agree with that. Over the quarantine, I feel like everyone, while they were trying to deal with everything, they were just listening to music, turning to art and everything. So it's really important. So can you share something about the Agam Agenda and what is this project all about?
Okay, so the Agam Agenda is a transdisciplinary platform, meaning we're trying to work with both scientists and policy wonks and artists and poets to tell different stories about the climate crisis. So we know a lot about the issues, but we need to hear more about the lived experiences of people, and that can reside in art. Those stories can be told through art. And that's what we're trying to do with the Agam agenda, is to reimagine the climate crisis through stories and art. So bringing in powerful narratives, but also music and visual arts into the way we think about climate. And as one of our contributing poets said, she said that in order for us to change the future, we also need to be able to imagine what it's going to be like and what we want it to be like. And that's where poetry and art can help us. So Agam agenda is we're trying to express or tell the stories of the climate without jargon, but still be based on the science, and also encourage people not to shy away from the policy part of it, because that's important. And so using the Agam agenda to bring everything and everyone together in a way where we can speak about it and also we can push for what we want. Like today, di ba? Pinag-uusapan natin, how are we going to push for NDCs and for nations to submit? And if we can get people to feel strongly about it, that's going to create stronger public pressure for our governments and for nations to submit their NDCs before December 31.
Wow, thank you for your work in Agam Agenda, ma'am. That sounds really good and powerful. So, can you also briefly introduce today's story?
Okay, I will share my screen if that's okay. Can I go ahead and start? All right, there we go. So this is us. This is the Agam Agenda, reimagining the climate conversation. And the story you're all going to hear today comes from the book Agam Filipino Narratives on Uncertainty and Climate Change, which was published by the ICSC, the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, in 2014. And as you can see, it won 3 national awards as one of the best anthologies in English and also best design. It contains 26 images and 24 narratives told in verse and prose in 8 Philippine languages. And it was reviewed briefly by Nomi Klein. She said it's exquisite, a deeply original concept executed with tremendous artistry. And just as a teaser before I go into the story, we're coming up with a new anthology called Harvest Moon, Poems and Stories from the Edge of the Climate Crisis. And this has over 30 photographs and 30 narratives in poetry and prose from 24 countries around the world in 9 different languages. And we're very excited to bring this book to all of you in 2021. So the story we're going to hear is Power Couple by Mei Ling Su. And as you listen, I suggest to our listeners to think about what this story has to do with today's topic, NDCs. And you'll see that it's a story that contrasts 2 very different power couples. And it also has a way of tying in the lives of these 2 power couples with larger systemic issues. And it's those larger systemic issues that we're talking about today, but the story shows us how those issues link to very real, very recognizable lives. So I won't say more. This is Power Couple by Mei Ling Su.
We are a power couple. We're amazing individuals and even more amazing together. We're Beyonce and Jay-Z, Victoria and David, Will and Jada, and Barack. We're picture perfect and pitch perfect. Neither of us were born into money. We came from the working class. We worked hard to get to college, and our parents worked hard to send us. We learned to speak and write the language of the capitalistic system. We became experts in its semantics and technologies. We work round the clock, work out and work in. We make deals around the world, from Asia to Europe, Australia, Africa, and the Americas. Servers, computers, laptops, smartphones, productivity apps work overtime. Our global economy relies on this. We are a power couple and we use power gear. We have the latest in iDevices, upgraded from the most recent planned obsolescence. On one hand, all our bills are paperless so we can save the trees. On the other, the thick haze of industrial pollution hangs over China as their factories pump out electroplastic perversions at the drop of a penny and their workers' souls. All this so we can make the world a better place, one selfie at a time. We tweet about eating organic, banning GMO, buying local, reducing our carbon footprint, recycling, donating to charities. We may get hacked and attacked, but we rebuild like spiders in the spring. When the battery runs low, we plug back into the wall, recharge, repeat. We are a power couple. We're amazing individuals. We are a power couple. We live hand to mouth, day to day. We have no education, no money, no opportunities. We farm, fish, hunt, toil in the heat and the rain. Every year our home is ripped to shreds by typhoons, floods, earthquakes, or volcanoes, and every year we scavenge enough materials to build it up again. Better, stronger. We're called resilient by the system that ravages our resources and spits us out, the remains of the carcass they have consumed and now consider waste. We are the ultimate recyclers, appropriating anything into our home. Old signs, worn tires, plastic water jugs. One power couple's trash is another power couple's treasure. We don't tweet or pin or Instagram. In fact, we're not plugged in. We just make do. We do. We are a power couple. We have no name you would recognize. We're invisible until we're at our most desperate, begging for relief. Yet, we persist. We will not die. During our childbearing years, we fruitfully multiplied. We have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We have nothing to give them but the will to survive. If they persist, we will not die.
Ayan, so that was The Power Couple by Mei Ling Su. And if you would like to hear more, I'm inviting everyone to listen to Agam, the Climate Podcast, where we host conversations with poets, artists, and scientists who take solace in the imagination. And you can hear Mei Ling Su and other poets read their work that they contributed to Agam Filipino Narratives on Uncertainty and Climate Change. So I hope that grounded us for today's discussion in the stories that are behind or that are propelling the climate action that we work so hard to carry on every day. So maraming salamat, Keith and Angeli. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much po, Miss Padma. That is a very, very wonderful and interesting story. As in that way, hindi lang the usual jargons about the climate sciences ang naririnig natin, kundi through this stories, we are able to feel within our hearts yung the reality of the climate crisis. Kasi iba talaga ang atake ng climate stories when it comes to spreading the word on the climate crisis. So thank you very much po for that. Um, Before we move on, Miss Padma, may konting mga tanong lang po ako kasi um, I am part of a group who started this initiative using visual art as a form of activism. That we started this Invisible Earth magazine. Then, what can you say to us? What can you advise to us who are just starting this advocacy? Paano pa po namin ma-push forward? Paano namin gagawang mas effective ang pag-spread ng word regarding the climate crisis through our means?
I think yung isang mahalaga is magsimula tayo sa mga komunidad natin. So start from where you are, and maybe your literary magazine and your visual art can be for those that are immediately around you. Yun yung naiisip kong isang hamon sa ating lahat is paano natin ilalapit ito sa mga kapitbahay natin, sa mga barangay natin, di ba? So if you have the capacity to do that, I think you would be accomplishing something really important. Tapos everybody has a role to play, and sometimes we find allies or kakampi or supporters in the least expected places, di ba? So talk to whoever you can, reach out to whoever you can to find support, to find readers. Yun siguro, yun yung mga mahalaga, and just keep going, and don't censor yourselves, di ba? Kung minsan, mas okay pang magkamali tayo kaysa sa sinesensor natin sarili natin, especially when it comes to artistic expression, di ba? Talo na tayo kung nagsimula tayo sa pagsisensor sa sarili, or kahit yung mga manunulat, sinasabi nila, isulat mo muna, mamaya mo na i-edit, di ba? So, yun, yung halaga is let's respect and love and nourish each person's creative expression and creative imagination also. And that's gonna keep us all going.
Yes po. Thank you very much po for that answer.
Sana,
And another,
sana nakatulong yun, or sana magamit
yes
niyo
po.
yun.
Very helpful po yun kasi this actually, I'll just gonna share a little bit about that. This is actually an initiative of a group of young climate advocates who are also trained by the Climate Reality Project, but spread across the world. Parang galing pa kami sa ibang bansa. So we are trying to collect stories from the global south and also spread this kasi more often than not, the voices of the global south are not heard very loudly. Kaya that's what one of the aims of our stories. Here we have another question po. Given your experience working with various scientists for Agam Agenda, how can they make their science relevant and digestible for the people?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think there's no question over whether or not the science is relevant. Ang nakikita natin is it's really relevant, and it's important. Siguro yun nga, the question leads us to the importance of language. Ano ba yung lengguwahe na ginagamit natin? Anong wika? Masyado bang technical, or paano natin mailalapit sa mga karanasan ng tao ang lengguwahe at ang kaalaman ng agham, di ba? So and I think that's really a challenge for all of us, not just for our colleagues who are scientists, di ba? We need to keep reflecting on how we speak about the climate crisis or climate change, and we need to keep challenging ourselves to speak about it in a way na pwede kong ipaliwanag sa anak kong 8 years old, pwede ko rin ipaliwanag sa anak kong 26 years old, pero magkaiba yung pagkakakwento, di ba? So I think that's one of the challenges there, is how we use language. Alam mo, may naalala kong kwento in one of, I interviewed Daryl Delgado, and when we did the 24 hours of reality, we listened to her reading in Waray and then in English of her poem Panawagan. And tapos may kinuwento siya sa akin na after Yolanda, taga-Tacloban siya, no? She realized na she and her siblings realized that they had the same recurring dream of parang madilim yung sky, tas may palapit na like a wall of water. And they had a word for it. I'm sorry, I don't remember, but they had a word for it in Waray. And they only realized this after na meron pala tayong salita that describes what was coming, di ba? And if you remember after Yolanda, some of the very heated discussion na mainit na usapan talaga is baka naman mali kasi yung nasabi kaya hindi naintindihan ng tao kung ano yung parating. So that challenge remains, and I think we're all really trying to refine our language, but also let's include other languages, hindi lang. So one is yung technical language, yung jargon, di ba? Paano natin yun gagawing conversational, di ba? Paano natin ipapasok yun sa kwentuhan? Mahilig tayo sa kwentuhan. And then the other challenge is, aside from the technical language, meron din yung medium na ginagamit natin. Is it going to be English, Filipino, Ilocano, Bisaya, Waray? Yun yung mga bagay na kailangang pag-isipan sa trabahong ito.
Yes, po. Very true yan na there is really a need for us to translate the different concepts or the jargons we use in the climate sciences in order for those in the grassroots community, para dun sa mga nasa komunidad talaga natin, is maintindihan nila itong mga pinagsasasabi nila. And I think that's one of the reasons why, kung naalala nyo po, few weeks ago, na-release yung study from Harvard that I think that was 60% of the Filipinos are not aware of the climate crisis or of climate change in general. And do you think that through this creative means, such as your Agam agenda, through the other visual artists, through the other artivists, do you think po isa ito sa key in order para sa atin na maipaintindi sa mga nasa community natin or sa nasa schools, para maipaintindi sa kanila itong climate crisis na nangyayari sa atin, and what can we do about it?
Definitely, I think storytelling and arts have a role to play. Pero siguro i-reframe ko din yung idea ng pagkaintindi sa climate crisis. Again, I think people are not totally unaware. I just think it's possible that they use different words to describe it. Nagkaroon ako ng isang experience na gano'n, no, na we worked with students in Far Eastern University na gumawa ng mini-sodes tungkol sa climate crisis. And many of them felt na hindi namin alam kung ano ang adaptation, ano ang mitigation, ano yung climate, how do you explain the science of climate change? And then nag-field sila. They went to communities of indigenous peoples, also of persons with disabilities, and also of street vendors to see if they felt that they were affected by climate change. And everybody said, hindi namin alam kung ano yan, ano yung climate change. Pero nung tinanong sila kung anong nararanasan nila sa yung pagbabago ng klima, ang dami nilang kwento. So again, we need to also look at when people were asked if they knew of the climate crisis, what exactly were they asked, di ba? So nung nag-workshop kami ng mga estudyante sa FEU, we really had to work around the jargon. And then once we removed the jargon, everybody realized that they knew and that they experienced every day what we talk of as climate change.
Yes, but that's super true. Kasi we are experiencing the different effects of the climate crisis firsthand. Mapabagyo man ito, extreme heat waves, changes in the rainfall patterns we are experiencing this year.
Salinization, di ba?
Yes po. Kaya siguro we are those who were asked are not aware of the technical terms, but they are actually experiencing the effects of climate change firsthand. And that's now the importance of personal stories din kasi makikita natin sa stories talaga nila kung paano ba nila nararamdaman or paano sila naapektuhan ng climate crisis. And I think one last question po, Miss Padma. What do you think, what is your advice to everyone, the Pinoy climate reality leaders, if they are having troubles on expressing or furthering their climate advocacy or spreading the word regarding the climate crisis? How can they make it easier, or paano nila mas mapapadali ang pag-spread ng word on the climate crisis, especially kapag they are working with the grassroots communities?
Hmm. I don't know if it's ever gonna get easy, Keith, di ba?
Yes. Feel that
um,
challenge po.
but how do we keep going? Siguro, yun yung, and well, also how do we get the information across, di ba? So, babalik ako ng babalik sa lengguwahe, and creativity, being creative, be aware of how you use the language, and always relate it to what people know. Kasi lahat ng tao may kaalaman, lahat ng tao may karanasan, and any engagement can be made richer by starting from what people know and what people have experienced. So I think we also have a responsibility na palawakan din natin yung sarili nating kaalaman at saka karanasan. So we can speak to more experiences of other people also.
Yes, well, thank you very much po, Miss Padma. And I hope that you can stick with us until the end of the episode. Later on, we will have another open forum. So for those who are watching through Facebook Live, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Miss Padma. And if you have questions for her, kindly send in your questions via the live chats. Thank you very much po ulit, Miss Padma, and
Thank
we'll
you,
see you again
Keith.
later.
Thank you for
Yes.
that. I enjoyed our exchange.
Yes po. Me too po. So yeah, we have seen the importance of art and the art being a useful tool in pushing forward our advocacy. Let us just remind our viewers to please share this podcast, not podcast actually, this webcast, Klimatotohanan, which happens every Saturday, time to be announced. So this is a venue for Pinoy climate reality leaders to have a discussion regarding the current issues and questions about the climate crisis. This webcast, why do I keep saying podcast? This webcast is a project of Pinoy Climate Reality Leaders. So we are inviting all Pinoy Climate Reality Leaders to join us in producing this webcast. Now, ituloy na natin ang discussion. Ituloy na natin ang kwentuhan. We are now moving on to the second part of this episode of Klimatotohanan. Joining me in the second part of today's episode is Mr. Reginald Rex Barrer, a Pinoy Climate Reality Leader and the Head of Climate Governance of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Hello po, Sir Rex, and again, thank you very much for being with us today.
Good afternoon, Keith. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sir Rex. Before anything else, kayo po ay nagtratrabaho sa ICSC bilang Head of the Climate Governance. For those who are not aware, especially the climate reality leaders, the ICSC, or Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, is the new host organization of the Climate Reality Project Philippine branch. Sir Rex, can you tell us something about the ICSC and the work that you are doing with the ICSC?
Okay. The climate governance team. The climate governance team works on the nexus, or the link between policy and science. So we work with both scientists and those who formulate policies, and see how they can work together to make sure that the policies that we create are relevant and that it is anchored on sound science. For example, it's evidence-based, and so that when we do implement all these things, they are not necessarily just created out of, let's say, a sense that it is supposed to be created into law, but that it is implementable and that it takes care of the welfare of those who will be affected. The Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities has been there for a while, and we've been working on different issues. For example, not only on policy, uh, we have worked on energy, for example, as well as transport, cities, for example, and all the links that they have with one another in relation to climate and sustainability.
Yes, but thank you very much for that. So that's a brief information about the ICSC. Sir, paano naman po kayo na involved with the nationally determined contributions? What is your involvement with that?
Sige. Uh, I had the chance or the honor of being a member of the Philippine delegation in negotiations for the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of my the focus of my participation there had to do with mitigation, which we will have an opportunity to elaborate on. And the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, fall under that in terms of the negotiating tracks that we follow. That happened because I also was doing my thesis on forest-related emissions and through forest, rather deforestation and forest degradation. And so I was able to put them all together, and I was able to follow or track the development of the NDC till the Paris Agreement when it was formalized.
Yes, but thank you very much for your work. So, I think many of our viewers have already an idea about the NDC. But
Mhm.
can you just briefly explain kung ano po ang NDC and what is the importance of NDC?
Okay. The anchor by which the Paris Agreement established as a treaty or as a protocol, for example, by 196, 97 countries, was that there had to be a way by which we reduce the emissions that we are uh, putting into the atmosphere. So nakasalalay doon sa uh, belief na everyone has to do their share now in terms of what we can do to reduce the emissions. So the NDC was the embodiment of the effort, and that the unique aspect of the NDC in relation to the Paris Agreement is that it is now from the perspective of the countries, no, the parties to the agreement. No? Kung tutusin, parang nagkasundo kayong lahat at sabi nyo may kailangan tayong gawin. Ngayon, depende na lang sa kung ano yung kakayahan natin, or looking at it from the perspective of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So, hindi ibig sabihin pare-pareho yung kailangan ninyong ibigay. But that you would also look at not only your responsibilities but your capabilities, as well as, let's say, for example, how much of that effort will be able to contribute to your own development.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that very brief explanation of the NDCs. I think mas naliwanagan ng ating mga audience who are watching via Facebook now kung ano ba talagang NDC and why do we have these NDCs. So, last 2015, the Philippines submitted its intended nationally determined contributions. Then this 2020, magsasubmit po ulit ng updated nationally determined contributions ang Philippines. So, ano pong pinagkaiba nung nabit natin 2015 at saka nitong 2020 na dapat natin i-submit?
Okay. The Paris Agreement was established, or it was agreed upon by countries in Paris in 2015, as we all know. But countries, in fact, were already being asked even earlier on. The discussion or the concept nga ng INDC, for example, of intended nationally determined contributions, was more or became more explicit in the 2013 Conference of Parties, or COP. No? So para doon sa mga sumusubaybay, alam naman natin kung ano yung mga acronym. Isa doon, yung pinakamatingkad would be COP, No? It happens on an annual basis, and in 2015 we had the Paris Agreement. But leading up to the Paris Agreement, countries had that opportunity to submit what they think they can contribute to emissions reductions. No? That's why it was intended. No? But at that time, no, it was more or less a sense of what do you think you can do? Ano yung kaya ninyo? No? So there was not, there was no commitment technically just yet that you will act on your intention. No? This is what we think we can do, and we are offering them. No? So the requirement of submitting an NDC, just to make a distinction, di ba? INDC and NDC, those who became signatories and ratified the Paris Agreement, depending on the unique processes of each country, is that when you now are a party to the Paris Agreement in 2020, you would begin the process of submitting, communicating what you state you will be contributing. So parang ano yan totohanan na to, hindi na to biruan. Kung sabi mo kaya mo to noon, binibigyan kita ng pagkakataon na sabihin sa amin kung kaya mo talaga to o hindi. So countries now, because it's 2020 and it's the start now of the Paris Agreement being subscribed to by all countries, now we are all expected as parties to submit our NDC. No? In the case of the Philippines, because we've already submitted an INDC, it's now a question of enhancing what we committed in 2015, and what the enhancement will be is what we will now be measured against. No? Talaga, sinabi mong gagawin mo yan, so sige, diyan ka namin susukatin.
That's great po pala. So, you mentioned a while ago about mitigation, and I think merong statement doon na mitigation as a function of adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you briefly explain that po?
Okay. Sige. Mitigation as a function of adaptation. Kung titingnan mo ang Pilipinas, we contribute only a very minute, a very small share of the emissions at a global scale, at a global level. We are not one of those who contribute to the current state where we are in. No? So, and in that sense, those that in fact contribute less to what is happening now in terms of globally having this much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are unfortunately the ones who are experiencing those events, particularly that are connected with climate change. Sa Pilipinas, bago pa man din nagkaroon ng malinaw na kaugnayan or relationship between, let's say, the events that we associate that are exacerbated by climate change. For example, typhoons. We've had typhoons. When I was younger, for example, we have had a lot of typhoons happen in 1 year. But the difference now is that they are more intense. No? They are more damaging. No? Mas malaki na yung epekto niya. Mas marami na siyang naapektuhan. No? So when we look at it in the context now of everyone making that commitment that we will mitigate, that we will reduce our emissions, we, in that context, still only have a very small amount of emissions reduction to, let's say, commit to or contribute. No? And therefore, in our case, as a developing country, at magkakaroon ka at sa mga discussions, for example, on climate change, often the discussion is what are developed countries committing and what are developing countries committing. The Philippines, as a developing country in that context, because of the impacts that we are experiencing, we have to be able to adapt to all these events, while also saying that, of course, we will commit to reducing our emissions. So adaptation measures, for example, has to have the lion's share, for example, of the funds that will come in, for example, in terms of, let's say, nature-based solutions, increasing your mangrove cover for coastal areas, increasing, for example, your forest cover, maintaining that, all the actions that we can take that are aligned or along the context of what is referred to as adaptation. So, of course, when you talk about that, you adapt, no? So you make those changes within your circumstances in order to minimize, if not totally prevent the impacts, no, of that. And then mitigation comes as a corollary to that.
Mm, yes, but I hope that our audience were able to um, understand what the phrase mitigation as a function of adaptation is. We also have in the NDCs, we have unconditional and conditional
Mhm.
NDCs.
Yeah.
Can you please differentiate what conditional NDCs are and unconditional NDCs are?
Okay. Uh, let's take the case of the Philippines. No? So when you talk about what we submitted as an INDC in 2015, our statement was that we will decrease our emissions 70% from the business as usual scenario. No? So, ibig sabihin nun, kung halimbawang itutuloy mo yung emission scenario, yung dami ng binubuga natin, no, na greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you take 70% of that, and essentially what does that look like in terms of reduction. So yun yung pinanggagalingan mo, no? But when we said that, when we committed that in 2015, we also said that this will only happen conditional, meaning that there has to be means of implementation. Okay, means of implementation in the form of funds, capacity building, no, or training, no, and technology transfer. Ito yung mga means of implementation mo, which means that kailangan mo tong mga to para magawa mo ang isang bagay. No? So, conditional yon doon. Kung unconditional, on the other hand, meron kan yung means of implementation, kailangan mo pa rin yun, pero hindi kailangan manggaling sa ibang tao. Parang sinabi mong may tumutulo sa bubong mo, pero wala kang yero, wala kang pako, wala kang martilyo. Yung means of implementation mo, o hindi ka rin marunong magpa-check ng, or you don't have the skills, for example, in order to plug that hole. Kapitbahay mo, karpintero, meron siyang yero, meron siya lahat ng kailangan niya. The means of trying to cover that hole is now conditional on the resources that you will have to get from someone else. In this case, for the Paris Agreement, it will be, of course, with other parties to the agreement. On the other hand, you will look at it as an unconditional effort on your part because you have your funds, for example. Funds in our case, when we look at them, nasa generally appropriated, nasa budget mo na siya, no? On an annual basis. If you recall, we just Congress just had their discussions or hearings on the budget. So that is where we anchor whether these things that we do on climate change, emissions reduction in particular, if they're already part of the programs, projects, and activities or actions in the budget, then this will no longer be conditional. No, they become unconditional in that sense. The way I understand it right now, the Philippines is looking at both unconditional and conditional components of the NDC that we will be submitting this year.
Thank you very much for that. So, conditional is with the help
Mhm.
of others. Non
Mhm.
unconditional is kung ano lang po yung kaya nating gawin standalone.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Do remember that it doesn't have to be all the three. Pwedeng
Yes
pondo
po.
lang, pwedeng capacity building, or even transfer of technology.
Mm,
Depends on what the mitigation option is.
yes po. So, the funds or those yung paggagalingan po ng mga nabanggit nyo na kanina is mostly manggagaling sa developed countries
Mhm.
and sa other agencies. So, ano po ang naging effect nung pag-withdraw ng US sa being one of the most developed countries and also, I think, key players? Ano
Okay.
pong effect nun sa Paris Agreement?
Mula sa perspective ng emission reduction, no? Sa pagbaba ng pagbuga, malaki, no? In the context that nag-uunahan, no? Right now it's China that's emitting the most, and that the US is now number two, no? It For a period of time it was the United States that was actually the biggest contributor, no? Again, this has to do with because they are now developed countries. No? The US particularly has been a developed country for the longest time. And the contribution as well of the United States to the overall pot, no? Yung pera na kung saan pwedeng pagkunan ng support for conditional actions or options, mitigation options that can be taken by developing countries. It's big, no? It's just interesting that even as they withdrew, no, last November 4, and there'll be about a month outside of the Paris Agreement now since then. Uh, with the changes that are happening beginning next year, they plan to go back into the Paris Agreement. So, in a way, it's good, but there is a degree of catching up the United States has to do, not only because of how it can help other countries in their efforts, but that it has to also look at the emissions reduction that it intends to do. I mean, this is a 4-year period by which uh, their emissions, for example, could have also tapered down even further, no? Creating, let's say, a bigger gap between them and China.
Yes po. Thank you very much po for that insight. Let's go back again to the terminologies related to the NDCs po, no?
Okay.
One of the um, reasons why we have this Klimatotohanan is actually to um, push forward the demand for a better and a more ambitious NDC. So bakit po palagi natin mini-mention yung more ambitious when it
Okay.
comes to
Sige.
NDCs?
Sige. Uh, Kasama sa agreement, no, sa Paris, na if you become a party to it, you have to submit your NDC, what you're committing to, and what you're submitting is only uh, applicable for a 5-year period. Of course, some countries, in the case, for example, of China, they already made a commitment that by 2060, their reductions will be to the point of, let's say, carbon neutrality, or to the degree that they can achieve net zero emissions by 2060. Some countries, in fact, have committed to a net zero objective or aim even earlier than that. No? Part of the agreement is that when you submit an NDC, it undergoes a review. No? Kasi the Philippines is not the only one that's going to submit this. Developing countries, all countries that are party to the agreement are supposed to submit them. And then this will be summed up. No? Pagsasama-samahin yan, titignan natin kung ano na yung epekto nito sa pagbaba ng emissions in the atmosphere. No? And remember, the long term target for the Paris Agreement is that as much as possible we hold the increase of the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees, and that we are supposed to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. So that is the gauge by which all the NDCs will be measured. No? Pag pinagsama-sama mo yan, nasaan na ba tayo in that range, no? In that range. Of course, we're looking at it well below 2 degrees. But currently, the estimates based on what has been submitted before 2020 is that we're looking at around 3 degrees, 3.5 to 3.8 degrees. No? So medyo malayo pa. No? It's a lot like you have a New Year's resolution, and then at the end of your New Year's resolution, titignan mo, for example, kung meron bang improvement. If you decide that you want to run, for example, you either look at how fast you were able to finish it, how long your distance, for example, in running, and so on and so forth. No? So you look at those things. No? So what does ambition have to do with it? In the next iteration, in the next cycle of submission of an NDC, the condition by which that has to be submitted is that it has to be higher than the last NDC you submitted. So parang after this year, you were already able to finish 5 kilometers running. Next year, kailangan hindi 5 kilometers ulit yung sasabihin mo. It has to be even a 1 kilometer improvement is already an improvement in that context. No? So lahat ng mga countries na party to the Paris Agreement, as they submit it, they have to submit an NDC that was much better than the last one. This is what we call the ratcheting up mechanism of the NDCs. No? So, and how do we do that? All countries are submitting their NDC 2020. No? And in fact, the CVF, or the Climate Vulnerability Forum, has pushed that all countries submit before midnight of December 31st, no, of this year. So once everyone has submitted that, the process for countries will now be to implement those NDCs. But for the UNFCCC as well, to put it all together, to sum them all up, to compare how much emissions in different sectors. And then in 2023, we have what is referred to as the global stocktake, the GST. So marami talagang jargon sa UNFCCC. In 2023, we will have a global stocktake. Doon magkakaroon ng discussion, for example, nasaan na nga ba talaga tayo? And essentially, it's also saying countries or everyone, ito pa yung kailangan natin gawin. So take a look at where you are, what else can we improve, and so on and so forth. And that is supposed to guide the next submission of the NDCs of countries in 2025. So you can look at it in the context na tumakbo ka, meron kang coach, sinasabi sa'yo ng coach mo, ito yung nakita ko, kung gusto mo na mag-improve, ito yung kailangan mong gawin. So it's in that context. And then we also submit the next NDC in 2030. But before that, we have a 2028 global stocktake again.
Thank you very much for that's a very good analogy actually dun sa paggamitin niyo po ng mga tumatakbo. So what are the essential, paano po natin masasabi na magandang NDCs? Paano natin masasabi na these NDCs will be able to help us really achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement? Okay.
You have to look at it in the sense that, of course, it has to be comparable. But before we go to the other details, when the agreement was made that countries are supposed to submit their NDCs, that is the binding aspect of being a party to the agreement. But how your NDC looks like, kanya-kanya yan. No? There's no one template, for example, that you're supposed to fill all the blanks. No? But there are things that, based on assessment of what they're supposed to look like, of course, you have to have a good reference point, a base year, which means that you have a sense based on a given year how much emissions you contributed, and then how much more you intend to contribute. No? So you have a reference point. No? Of course, you also have to have a time frame or a period of implementation. Like I said, some countries meron na sila until 2050 to be net zero. No? In our case, our plan is anchored on 2040 because we have the Ambition 2040. Um, that is the Economic Development Plan, National Development Plan based on the NEDA's projections. No? So what we want to be able to do is basically align all the plans of the country, and so that we are able to look at how they affect one another. No? So the scope and coverage, as well as the planning process, and may also include an implementation process. No? The scope would mean, for example, where, what sector will contribute to your emissions reduction. So in our case, we have six. No, we have six sectors. You have energy, waste, industrial process, and product use. You have forestry, transport, and energy. So those are considerations. And then, of course, you have to have assumptions, approaches. No? So um, we're looking at it from the perspective, of course, of the national government, being the party or the representative of the country to the Paris Agreement. It has to be in that context that it's a national effort. No? It has to be a national effort. But other sectors also have to come in. No? We're only looking at these sectors. In fact, that is one area of improvement that we can do, and we can discuss that in a little while now. So methods include, for example, or assumptions include, for example, what I refer to as yung base year, yung accounting system mo. How do you account for them? Which parts of the sector, for example, do you account for? In the case of transportation, it was largely or primarily road transport. No? According to the Department of Transport, it was about 90% of almost 90% or so. Ang consideration nila was essentially emissions from transportation. This is also where a good greenhouse gas inventory comes in. No? So again, when you're doing essentially an inventory of the appliances that you use in your house. Ganun yun. No? Tinitingnan mo na gaano katagal nakabukas yung ilaw mo sa isang kwarto, electric fan, air conditioner, TV, charging ng mobile telephone mo, how often do you use that, if you have games that you play on your television, etc. All these things. No, your computer, for example, if you're plugged in the whole day, your internet now, for example, all these things come into play. And then you determine, for example, how much you will be reducing in terms of emissions based on the things that I mentioned. These are desirable considerations. Of course, again, because of the time frame of implementation, kailangan magkasundo siya na every 5 years magsasubmit ka. No? So, mula dun sa submission mo, tapos dun sa susunod, gumagawa ka na ng evaluation mo kung saan ka magi-improve, no? Kung magka-cut ka ba sa isang computer, for example, hindi ka na gagamit ng aircon, sa gabi ka na lang gagamit ng aircon, and so forth, no? There are also some considerations, no? For example, there's a need for transparency, no? So I mentioned global stock taking earlier. The transparency is also relevant, no? In the sense that when you say you're committing to this reduction, the way forward or the path by which you will be able to address that should be clear. It has to be complete. I mentioned comparability and consistency, no? As well as, let's say, ito madalas pag-usapan to, yung tinatawag na double counting, which means that you cannot present a higher number because in one sector it was already counted, and then in another sector it was also counted. So that has to be avoided. Hindi lang sa isang country, pero between countries as well. Because there are what are referred to as cooperative approaches, no? By which one country helps another to reduce its emissions. So may ganung provisions in the Paris Agreement. Yep.
So ang rami po pala, and
So,
I hope maraming our viewers were able to take note of those things kasi those are essential. Um, Connecting now the topic of NDCs to the theme of today's Klimatotohanan, how can we use the NDCs to build a more climate and disaster resilient future?
okay. The crux of the discussion. No?
Yes po.
The NDC for the Philippines is not only a submission to the UNFCCC as a target, no, for our contributions there. No? So as a party, the Philippines looks at it as the pathway by which we can achieve our own national industrialization. Binanggit ko kanina yung kailangan magtugma, no? Magkasundo, for example, yung commitment natin or reduction natin sa emissions doon sa Philippine Economic Development Plan. No? So in that sense, what we want to say is that we will use our NDC in order to achieve our own economic development. No? Resiliency comes in the form of being able to ensure that everyone has the opportunity or is in that path to improve their economic well-being as well as the other aspects of their lives. No? So if you reduce, for example, our emissions, we're looking at national industrialization in the context of a low carbon development or a low emission development. So nagkakaiba ko minsan yung reference doon. But the whole idea is that hindi ibig sabihin kailangan maging polluter ka muna para maabot mo yung development na iniisip ninyo. Kasi pwede mo siyang lagpasan at the opportunities, for example, for a low carbon development is in fact also consistent with, let's say, a progressive society, no? A progressive environment. There are in fact now more job opportunities in renewable energy than there was before. There is, for example, now a situation where in fact solar energy or renewable energy in terms of cost is lower than let's say the fossil fuel dependent economy. No? So there are opportunities for that. Of course, for the Philippines, there has to be a path by which we are able to match the two. And if you look at, for example, what we are experiencing, not only in that sense of, let's say, what are we going to contribute in terms of emissions reduction and economic development, we are one of the most vulnerable countries. No? As a member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, it clearly identifies, in fact, that we have a lot to gain by embracing this pathway. So it's not just a question of seeing the issue or framing the issue in terms of climate change, but that it is also an economic issue. And if we are going to try and be able to address all those impacts that we are experiencing right now, if we are going to be able to get up the next day, go back to work after a typhoon, it can only happen if all these things are set in place and take this opportunity moving forward.
Thank you very much, Sir Rex. Last question for our conversation. To the best of your knowledge, what is the extent of the development of the Philippine NDC now?
Okay.
Especially that we need to submit it by midnight, December 31, 2020.
Okay. We're not necessarily cramming, no? if you look at it that way, we're not necessarily looking at it in terms of it's December 30 and everyone is panicking that we have only tomorrow or 24 hours from now, no, to submit that. In fact, we are, if I'm not mistaken, based on the assessment, we are practically in the home stretch. All the 6 sectors have submitted the mitigation options that they think they can contribute to this NDC that we're submitting. As I understand it, or as I was informed, agriculture, no, through the Department of Agriculture, has already submitted theirs. No? And the role of the Department of Agriculture in this, or in all our submissions, is critical, because if you go back, binanggit natin kanina, mitigation as a function of adaptation. And the Department of Agriculture, in fact, uh, gives a lot of emphasis to the adaptation priorities of the Philippines. Of course, it's also submitting its mitigation options, no? Along with the Department of Environment, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Transportation. So all these things, all the numbers that have been crunched, they are now undergoing vetting consistently through what was developed as a technical working group, no, for the NDC. No? It was a dedicated group of people from the different agencies, and that they're looking at the numbers now. So each of the sectors have a quantifiable number. They have mitigation options that they've identified. Some that are already unconditional, as we've pointed out. Some are conditional. Some are linked with one another. No? For example, that one action can be taken only if the other department, for example, committed to that as well. So they have to work together. No? But again, there are a lot of other sectors. Local governments, for example, can come in. No? And so there's a large window of opportunity. No? What remains to be done is that when each of these sectoral agencies identified those options, other stakeholders had to come in. No? Industry, for the processes, for example, for waste, of course, other stakeholders. For forestry, you have a lot of civil society organizations. The academe, for example, come in because of the science or the research or the knowledge that they can contribute. No? That has to happen in terms of, eto na yung ano natin, mitigation options natin, eto yung numbers natin, an opportunity for other stakeholders to come in and look at it as well. That has to happen, and that hasn't happened just yet. And then, of course, what we will have to eventually submit, no? Long before, if possible, the midnight of December 31st. No? Habang nag-New Year na tayo, dapat wala na tayong problema niyan. And the text of the NDC is essentially what will embody our contributions for the next 5 years, no? In terms of the programs, so on and so forth. That has to be signed off by the president, and that is what we are going to submit. No? So essentially, those 3 things. No? The technical working group may be done with their part. They may have to elevate it to the different secretaries, for example. These are the final numbers. The CCC has to come in because it's coordinating all these things. Schedule that multi-stakeholder meeting, for example, whether virtual. Hopefully, the pandemic has thrown a monkey wrench in the timetable, no, of course. And then, of course, the imprimatur of the president, no, who has, in his own way, emphasized the significance of countries, not only the Philippines, to do their share in the effort. No? So these 3 things are the things that we have to check off eventually. And we're done. The next part of that, hindi ibig sabihin nag-submit na tayo, that's it. Of course, the implementation of the NDC for the next 5 years, as well as preparation for the global stock taking. And if I'm not mistaken, the CCC has also initiated an assessment and review of the National Climate Change Action Plan. And so the NCCAP, by which we anchor all these things, and the NDC should also be consistent with one another. No? That has to be reviewed. Yep.
Yes, but thank you very much, Sir Rex. I've learned a lot about our discussion regarding the nationally determined contributions. For our viewers on Facebook, you may now send in your questions for Sir Rex to answer. I'll just read some of the questions that were already sent to me, Sir Rex.
Okay.
Um, we have here a question from Seth Pilapil. Um, Updates about our NDC submissions. Is the CCC making a substantial progress? And will we be able to submit it before midnight, December 31st?
Yeah. Hi, Seth. Thank you for your question. Uh, that was what Keith and I discussed before that. Let me just note as well that the work on preparing the enhancement of the NDC, in fact, happened, if I'm not mistaken, around 2018, late 2018. And 2019 was essentially the bulk of when the Climate Change Commission worked on this. We will have to fine tune our processes because what's good about the submission is that it's not a one-time thing. We'll have to work on this particularly in the next 5 years, for example, and we will use the stock taking in order to determine how we can improve on that NDC submission this year.
Yes, well, thank you very much for furthering that um, answer. So, isa pa pong question. Some suggestions that the NDC will stifle our economic development. What is your opinion on that?
The intent of the NDC is not necessarily to stifle our ambition. If you look at it in the context of, let's say, preventing us from, let's say, pursuing options, we're not necessarily looking at it from that perspective. We're not. There was in the history of the negotiations, for example, developing countries as a whole, no, and there are negotiating blocks there that, of course, the lion's share of the work should be on developed countries because of their larger contributions to the emissions in the environment. And in fact, a larger expectation is placed on developed countries because they are also expected to contribute to what I've mentioned earlier when we were discussing how does the withdrawal of the US impact this. Developed countries are expected to contribute to a fund, no? The $100 billion fund, which is the base, not the ceiling, that can be used, no, for helping developing countries. No? Outside of the submissions of the NDC, we have the Green Climate Fund, which is also an opportunity for countries, developing countries, to access to help all their efforts. Sa Philippines, the amendment of the Climate Change Act, no, which became into law in 2019, rather in 2009, the amendment allowed the creation of the People's Survival Fund. No? And the People's Survival Fund allows local governments to also fund their adaptation efforts. Remember again that mitigation, the NDC being the epitome of the mitigation efforts, that has to go hand in hand with adaptation efforts. So we're not necessarily leaving people behind. Local governments have a very big role to play in the adaptation efforts. No? It's not necessarily just the national government that has to act on this. No? And that's the reason why we also have the NDRRMC for the disasters, and they have their own counterparts. No? And adaptation plays a very large role in that. Of course, let's also be clear that mitigation, as defined or as it is used in disaster, is not the same as in climate change. No? So let's not get confused on that. But those things are happening all at the same time, again, for a country like the Philippines. So let's not look at it in that context. There are indeed a lot of opportunities. The Philippines, for example, for the longest time depended on geothermal energy. And so in our energy mix, we have a renewable energy, in fact. No? And so the whole idea now is to increase renewable energy in the mix. No? That has also been held, for example, by the declaration of the Department of Energy for a moratorium of coal plants, for example. So if we are able to still consistently support the kind of development that we want and be able to reduce our emissions, economic development and reducing our emissions are not necessarily conflicting objectives.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And thank you to those who sent their questions. Please continue sending in your question because later on we will still have a very short open forum with our speakers. Thank you very much again, Sir Rex, for being with us and having this conversation with us in this episode of Klimatotohanan.
Thank you, Keith.
We will hear again with Sir Rex later during the open forum. But now let's move on, reminding again everyone that the Klimatotohanan of the Climate Reality Project Philippines, organized by Pinoy Climate Reality Leaders, happens every Saturday, time to be announced. This is a weekly webcast, which is a venue for dialogue among Pinoy climate reality leaders to increase their knowledge and deepen their understanding of the climate crisis and help themselves take bolder climate action. We are calling climate reality leaders to help us in organizing and producing this weekly webcast and for it to continue as planned. Please watch and participate in this webcast. Um, like and share the webcast using our hashtags, hashtag Klimatotohanan, hashtag Ask the Experts, hashtag Better NDC 2020, and hashtag Lead on Climate. Please also host live and watch parties of the webcast. Thank you very much again. And let's move on to the next part of our Klimatotohanan episode. Angeli?
Thank you, Keith and Sir Rex. Now may I call on Sir Tony Lavinia. He's a law professor and the former dean of Ateneo School of Government. Good evening, Dean Tony.
Good evening, Anjali. Good evening, Keith.
Hi, sir. So we talked a lot about NDCs. So for you, why is it important that these commitments to reduce greenhouse gases are nationally determined? And do we have any current policies in place to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions?
Maybe we have to start with where this comes from. No? I mean, why is it nationally determined? And I can say this from a perspective of having negotiated and participated and worked on this issue for 30 years now, even before the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the early years, and specifically in the first 20 years of the global work we were doing on climate change, the obligations of countries were imposed from above, from top to bottom. In other words, countries would negotiate targets, would negotiate commitments, and then they would say, okay, developed countries, you do this, developing countries, you do this developing countries, this type, you do this, you do that. In other words, it was not nationally determined. It was internationally determined through a process of negotiation that made it very difficult because countries have different positions on what their responsibilities are, right? And countries have different opportunities to reduce emissions, opportunities to also for adaptation to respond to climate change. There's a principle in the international law called the common but differentiated responsibilities. Developing countries have always pushed that developed countries must take the lead, and developing countries will only follow. Yet, we were not able to make a lot of progress with an approach which was top-down. So, when we launched the Paris Agreement negotiations in 2011, this was a big issue, whether or not, once again, should we have one goal internationally, and then internationally we then allocate, okay, US ito ang gagawin mo, EU ito ang gagawin mo, Philippines ito ang gagawin mo, China ito yung gagawin mo. And in the midst of that discussion, finally consensus was arrived at, that's no longer workable. It's better if every developed and developing country decide on their own what they can contribute to the problem, to addressing the problem of climate change. Kaya it's called nationally determined contribution. It's a contribution to reduce emissions, a contribution to adapt to climate change. But this time, nationally determined, not determined by the world, but determined by each country on what they could do depending on their circumstances. But the idea was, you add all of this together, these NDCs together, and then you measure and you say, the world is now in the right direction. But if you're not going to be in the right direction yet, then you have to increase ambition. So the nice thing about the NDCs is you can change it as often as you want, every 5 years, every 3 years. You can change it based on opportunities that you're allowed, that you see, based on what you can do. No? So I actually find it very attractive that we're able to do this. And the only question is how to do it, how to implement it properly. And you have to start with what you're already doing. I mean, the Philippines, you start with what the opportunities are based on what we are doing. I mean, so we do have laws on energy. The Renewable Energy Act is one of those. We also have laws on forestry to apply to forest and climate actions. We have laws on solid waste, because that too is a important driver of climate change, the methane emissions from solid waste. Unfortunately, we don't really have a climate change relevant law for agriculture that has to be done. The same with transportation, because transportation is very, very important as well. No? So actually, we still have a lot of gaps. No? I mean, in our laws. I mean, I was listening to Kit's discussion with Rex, who I've worked with extensively before. It's very enlightening. My concern lang is our discussion of NDC now is based on what it was in 2015 rather than on what is actually required now in 2020, where we should actually double our efforts. Diba? The 2015, to be honest and be very frank, we have to think about decarbonization in the Philippines, for example, like many other countries are now doing. Yun ang pinag-usapan in many other countries, decarbonization. Japan said by 2050, China by 2060. US will probably go 2050 or 2060 as well. In other words, the nice thing about NDC is that in fact it is dynamic. But if you miss the boat kasi in the first attempt, I don't think you should catch up from that boat, but actually leapfrog to the next stage, right? And that's why I would like to see what the final numbers are going to be, the final numbers from every sector and the total numbers for the Philippines, and in fact whether as a climate change affected country, we are able to say that we are contributing much more than we said we will do in 2015. Because in essence, for me, when we were not able to get our 2015 target right in 2016 or 2017, that boat left already. And we're now in 2020, and the global stock is about to happen, and stakes are much higher. We just went through this awful 4-week period of intense storms and typhoons. It looks like we're about to go through another 2 to 3 week period. Another 3 to 4 storms are coming our way. we really cannot be a laggard in terms of what the NDC should be. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So you mentioned decarbonization. Do you think that's possible for us here in the Philippines? And if yes, who would the key players need to be?
Of course, it's possible. I mean, and the key players, of course, are Department of Energy, Department of DENR, Department of Transportation, and Department of Agriculture, Agriculture, DENR, and DOE, and Transportation. But of course, you need finance and NEDA for that, because you need many of the things you do in your NDC to be financed by climate development partners. So you need to do that. No? Well, lots of countries are doing that now. That's for now, I've decided that I will just work at the international side and not work too much on the national side for many reasons. So I'm engaged in a lot of discussions across the board on climate justice, on global stocktake, on how to change the way we negotiate, and the discussion is really around that. I mean, as I said, because there was a boat in 2015, we actually, the way I put it, we launched the boat, but we never, rowed the boat. I mean, and so I think, and that's fine. I'm not gonna blame anyone. I don't. I mean, climate is a complex reality from a domestic point of view. I helped build all the different institutions on climate in the Philippines, and it's always been a challenge. So it's not. There's no. There's no. I have no regret, no criticism about why it is like that. But the thing is, when you miss the boat, you have to leapfrog, and go ahead of the pack, and just say that this one has been missed. We go to this one, and that's the kind of attitude we need to have. I mean, and but I sort of think that the reason why I work among others internationally is if I can get a lot of other countries to do that, and convince a lot of especially decision makers, being one of the most senior people now in the world on climate change, then I think it will also help the country, because then they will see that other countries are actually doing that. And it's quite amazing what other countries, developing countries, are doing now. No, and so I think we can learn from that, because we also don't want to be a laggard with respect to those other countries.
Okay. So, sir, we also talked about the deadline of the NDCs. What are the implications if we don't submit our NDCs on time? And what needs to happen for us to be able to submit it for the deadline?
Well, for the first one, then the nature of NDCs is that they're nationally determined. That includes when you submit it. I mean, in other words, of course, for us, the consequence is very simple. That means you didn't do something on an issue that affects you a lot. And that's why it's not acceptable, because basically we're one of the number one victims of climate change. And if you don't contribute, something that is nationally determined, not even pressured from outside, then basically you're saying you don't care about an issue that affects you. And all your rhetoric about climate justice doesn't mean anything in that context. You absolutely have no credibility when you talk about climate justice, yet not do something that you can do in your own country. Absolutely. You cannot demand for climate finance. You cannot demand for climate justice. You cannot demand technology transfer if you are not doing something on your own. Because even the countries that are much poorer than us, I always say this, we always say kasi low emissions country tayo, but that's relative, di ba? Low emissions are related to China, related to the US, related to Japan, even related to Indonesia, for example. We're low emissions, But we're high emissions related to 170 other countries. We are in the top third of countries pa rin. Number 34, 35, certainly the top 40 countries pa rin tayo in terms of emissions, even if we're low compared to the ones ahead of us. So there's really no excuse for that. I mean, well, what needs to happen? I guess, because I know that a lot of work, and Rex was pointing that out earlier, a lot of technical work has been done, di ba? I think what needs to happen is that big decisions have to be done by the policymakers, and it's very important that they actually understand what those decisions are. I know Keith was also talking and asked that question about what do you say to people who say that your development will be affected if you don't with the NDC. That's really bullshit already. That argument does not make sense economically. Doesn't make, of course, environmentally it has never made sense, but even economically it doesn't make sense. No, because look at what the storms have just done, right? And if you continue on in your old ways of energy, agriculture, transportation, you will end up really forever a third world country with bad technology, with dirty technology, with technology that doesn't work. It's that, diba? I mean, I just spent the whole afternoon, the whole morning actually in Masungi JU Reserve, in up the mountains, which is just an hour away from Metro Manila, and looking at all the different things that are happening, the threats just around us, on land use and development, right? And on quarrying, for example. And the same old argument, I'm proud to say that 25 years ago, I already, within the DENR and outside the DENR, pushed for closing all quarry sites in Rizal. And the same answer was given to me again by some people, you know what I mean? Or some people said that this is the answer they will give you, that everything will stop in Metro Manila, no construction, no, that's bullshit. Because there are alternatives, always. But they do not look at the alternatives because of power, because of wealth, because of power interest. And that's got to stop, because just, the harm that we just did to the country because of that attitude, we just saw that, right? I liken the way I describe it. I give talks on climate change now almost every day and all over the world, no? And the way I describe what happened to us in the last 4 weeks is like, actually war is appropriate. It's like war, and it's all aerial war, right? And again, waves and waves and waves coming from the air, wind and rain. And then we didn't know that the ground troops that were invading us was water, were floods. And those ground troops, we were the ones. We were the ones that built those ground troops that destroyed many of our even now, maybe, even now you go to those places in Cagayan, those places even here in the east of Metro Manila that's been destroyed and lives destroyed. And it's that attitude, quite honestly. And that's why we have to, I go back to the idea of we have to leapfrog and be radical actually in the NDC and in what we have to do. And that's really, that the issues are there. I mean, the solutions are all there. I mean, I don't limit NDC to because I was one of those who negotiated the concept of NDC through the years. And I've always said in the Philippines that for us, an NDC is both a mitigation and adaptation measures. So for me, nature-based adaptation, which is really what we need to do, what we have to prioritize now. I mean, it's an NDC itself. I mean, zero deforestation, zero quarrying for areas that can threaten us. All of that needs to be in your NDC moving forward. No.
Thank you, sir. So there are some people who question the commitment of countries towards accomplishing their NDCs. How do you think we can hold our government accountable to the NDCs that they commit to?
Well, at the end of it, it's when they come out with it. The technical part is easy because you can see, we know our energy data, we know our agriculture data, we know our forestry data, we know our transportation data. I mean, whatever NDC they have for certain sectors, it's not too difficult to assess whether that's for me, the assessment is whether it's ambitious or not. That's really the main assessment. And then the next step is how will they implement it, right? As Rex pointed out, there's going to be a mix of NDCs and mix of ways of doing it, both in terms of local support and international support. And we need to we need to identify that, and then you hold them accountable. The next steps, you hold them accountable for what they actually do. And is there a plan? I mean, as I said, for me, the boat that we missed in 2015 was right after we came out with our NDC in 2015, which was very ambitious, but unfortunately not realistic because it required unconditional support, financial support from our development partners. And that's really not realistic. That's also not acceptable. And that's also not true because we're already spending a lot of our own money, on forests, on many things. We're spending a lot of our own money already. So you really cannot say, and you cannot let another country or other countries support everything that you are doing, which benefits you, right? And that's why even then in the debate moving forward, then my position, actually, I wouldn't have wanted a 70% reduction because I know that would be unrealistic and it would be difficult to find which is locally supported. Maybe something less ambitious like 30 or 40% at that time. At that time, I want to stress that at that time would have been better. You know what I mean? And then where you identify, then you can come up with a concrete plan on who will finance whom and what will you actually do to get it going, right? So that's what I would expect for NDC now, that when they come out. I haven't really followed it as much as Rex and others have done because I've decided that I want to, I have a better contribution to make globally at this point in time, given my experience. I mean, so that's really my focus right now in terms of that. But I think what I would like to see is in fact basically a plan, di ba? A program of action is what I would like to see. As always, the numbers are not as important as what the plans are and how they will do it. But it needs to be much, that's a thing, because it's 2020, it's 5 years after. So it has to be more ambitious than, theoretically, it should be more ambitious than what it was. But that's what everyone is being asked to do. And that's why there's this pressure to adapt these medium-term goals. For those of you, those who are listening who are in the Paris these negotiations, you will remember that that's what we were pushing. Some of us were pushing. Decarbonization was what some of us were pushing in all of those discussions from 2011 to 2015. We didn't get it at that time. Okay? But now we have it. Because it's 5 years later after 2015. In fact, the way I see it, you actually have to even go further. I am concentrating on liability now. And who should pay for loss and damage and that kind of thing. I mean, because that requires cutting edge work for a lawyer to do. No, I mean, and there's several efforts to also do that as well internationally.
Thank you, sir. So maybe ask your opinion on the news that the lower house will pass a bill declaring an environmental and climate emergency.
I actually, yeah, I heard that. I saw that. I didn't see the text. No, first, that's welcome. I've been writing about that for 2 years already, since 2018. and I hope the Senate will have an alternative. I hope it's a joint resolution, because then a joint resolution, a resolution by the House doesn't have any effect by itself, or a resolution by the Senate. A joint resolution adopted by both houses would be good. But what I would like to see is not just the declaration of the emergency, but an indication of the priorities that should be in that should be a consequence of the emergency, and then a localization process, right? A process by which we localize emergencies, and how LGUs can also declare their own climate emergencies. So that's what I would like to see. I mean, I actually wrote a few articles after the events of the last few weeks, and one of them, the last one, I co-wrote with I think the best people in the field of disaster risk reduction, climate and forest, and Chris Bercy of my colleagues in UP, actually, John Pulin and myself, and we identified 7 top priorities that we have to do in a climate emergency, and because then just a declaration of climate emergency by itself is self-evident, diba? There has to be consequences when you declare climate emergency. So, for example, we've taken gigantic steps in the renewable energy field. I mean, with the cap now on moratorium on new applications, greenfields they call it, for coal power plants. But I think they should stop everything that's on the line that's already been approved, that's not yet been built. And I think there should be a plan to reduce that considerably in the existing ones in the next 10 to 15 years.
Sir, so a while ago you mentioned that most of your work right now is considering who should pay for the losses and everything. So in the Philippines, how would you identify who should pay for these losses? Would it be international, local, or a mix of both?
It has to be a mix. Let me put it this way. Theoretically, there's an international mechanism for loss and damage that's still being developed. My view is that should be applicable to rich countries and to top corporations. And some fund will have to be created for that, and then some procedures for making claims on that. But climate justice also has to be done at the domestic level, because the truth is, as I always say in all my discussions, I mean, the poor countries suffer more than rich countries who benefit more from the system that created the problem. But poor people in all countries, including in poor countries, suffer more than the rich in all countries. So our poor, indigenous peoples, local peoples, farmers, workers, they suffer more than the rich people of the country. And that's why it's very important too. One thing I would like to see in our NDC are just transition measures, because it's wrong to make the poor pay for our mitigation measures. Absolutely wrong, unethical for that. Even for environmental organizations, now I always tell them, when you ask for something, a radical change in the environmental and all, you always have to have a solution for the workers that are going to suffer for the things, because otherwise you will not get the support of the poor and the people. And so I think just transition is a very important agenda that has to be part of any kind of changes that we have to do. Internationally, we have that the loss and damage mechanism that needs to be developed further. Maybe it will take a few more years to do that. But locally, we should also have that. We have long needed an environmental liability law anyway, a strict liability law for environment. And I think that's where you can insert a climate justice and environmental justice perspective.
Thanks, sir. So we have a question that just came in, and they asked, we want the developed countries to pay for the loss and damages, but is that just? Is it okay to demand that from them?
Yes, of course. Of course it's okay. Um, of course it's okay. But I have to include, just to say, when I say developed countries, in my courses, I always include China as a developed country. Uh, well, China just said that there's no more poor people in China. Probably an exaggeration, but 95% accurate. So I traveled in China a lot and work in China a lot, and it is a developed country. Um, so I would include China also in that. I mean, even if historically it might have been as responsible, in the last 20 years it has had enormous contribution as well. So I think that's why I wouldn't use the word developed and developing countries, because that has a historical meaning. I would just say rich countries, whether they're considered developed or developing countries, rich countries.
Okay. So, sir, being a climate justice advocate, can you please explain to our viewers what that means and how can climate justice be achieved?
Well, it simply means that those who created the problem should bear the responsibility, the main responsibility for addressing it. That's historical. And then the present is those who are contributing more to the problem should also bear the cost of solving it, including the adaptation cost. And that's a principle that is true at the global level, but also true at the national level. So in our country, the rich, the corporations who have benefited a lot from the system should also bear the cost. It should not be workers. It should not be the ordinary people. It should not be indigenous peoples that suffer the bear of this. So it's really just a question of who bears the cost for addressing a problem that affects all of us, but also affects the poor more. It doesn't have to be through lawsuits, if you're asking that question. In some countries, it can be through lawsuits. It can be through administrative responsibility systems. It can be through, moral claims. I'm working now with several law schools that I work with, or starting discussions with some of them that so I also teach in many schools, teach environmental law, and it's something I'm trying to get my law students to be interested in also later. So how do you document? Because the question earlier was who will pay for whom, right? Who will pay for what? Well, the question is actually what happened. Before you can even ask the question who will pay, you will have to ask, ano nangyari, di ba? Ano nangyari? We all know from media, but media reports are not legally actionable, right? Because it requires a different discipline. Law is different. You have to have affidavits. You have to swear before notary publics, right? You can do videos, you can do visuals, but they have to be identified. When was it taken? Who took it? So I'm now training people for that, because that's the future. I'm actually trying to think ahead, 10 years ahead, and 10 years ahead, that's what we're going to be doing. A lot of the things that we're going to be doing is going to be a lot more climate justice work. I always, when I teach this course and when I talk about it globally, I always divide the phases of climate action. First was mitigation by developed countries only. Believe it or not, from 1990 to 2000, and I was very active then already, all that we were asking, or mainly asking, was developed countries reduce their emissions. In 2000, we started asking about adaptation. We demanded support for adaptation. And then by 2010, we now agreed that everyone must mitigate. Everyone must reduce emissions. Although developed countries will take the lead, but everyone must do that as well. So mitigation by developed countries, adaptation by all countries, especially support for adaptation by developing countries, but for developing countries, mitigation for all, but differentiated according to circumstances. That's the Paris Agreement. And then from 2015 onward, it's climate justice, liability, responsibility, accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Tony. So we have time for one last question. So someone asked about the 1.5 climate goal. Do you think that's achievable, and how important is it for the Philippines to reach that?
I start with how important. Well, it's whether how many islands are going to be left for us, right? It's how many islands are left for us. That is it's how many storms we're gonna have. For 1.5 and 2, you might have doubled the storms. You have to remember that 1.5 for us probably means 3 or 4. 2 degrees for us means 5 or 6. 3 degrees for us means 6 or 7 or 8. 4 degrees means 10 for us. So the higher it is, the more. 1 degree might mean we lose 1.5 degree. We might mean we lose the reclaimed area of Manila. 2 degrees might mean we lose Santa Cruz and Ermita. Certainly 3 or 4 degrees means we will lose UST and all of those other places, big parts of Metro Manila. It's that. We have to do all the studies for what that means, but that's really the difference. So 1.5, the only reason it's 1.5 because it's the only thing that's doable now. We certainly can do 1. We're over 1 already. Sometimes we go over 1.5. Generally, we're over 1.2 or 1.3. So, but 1.5 is doable, but lots of things have to come together for 1.5 to be doable. And we only have 10 years to be able to do that, or even less. I would say less. I would say 10 years again because of the pandemic. The pandemic gave us a little bit more time, but not much. Not much. But what we now see too is what I've seen that's different from even 6 months ago with the pandemic is how important it is to understand the role of biology or biological resources, mountain ranges. These last 4 weeks, it's amazing how much we learned about how the Sierra Madre is so important for Luzon. We've always said that, but we've never seen it this way.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, Dean Tony, and for your expertise and teaching us about all these things. So just another call to all Filipino climate reality leaders to watch, participate in the webcast, and they can talk back, volunteer, like, share on their social media, and host live watch parties through the webcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Tony and Angeli, for that very enlightening discussion. I was listening dito sa likod and grabe ang discussion. It's very engaging. It's very informative. So thank you very much po. Can we ask Sir Rex Barer, and I'm not sure if Miss Padma is here, to give closing statements for our viewers. Sir Rex, maybe you could go first, then Dean Tony.
Okay. Good evening to all the climate reality leaders, to my boss, former boss, to Dean Tony. We were in several COPs together, and in fact, my last opportunity to work with him as well in relation to that was in the Paris Agreement. There is still a lot of work to be done. Let me just in essence close for my part in relation to the 1.5 that was referred to by Angeli earlier. It's not only a target for the Philippines. Let's be clear about that. It's a target for all countries that are working on reducing the emissions. In fact, it's not even only looking at it from the perspective of the convention or the Paris Agreement. It's not something that is going to be limited essentially whether you are a party to it or not. You're going to be affected. So to the extent that everyone has a role to play, that's always true. And everything that we've discussed at this stage, for example, the declaration of a climate emergency, the emergency has been there for the longest time. And in fact, there are a lot of things that we already knew way back when, but that we are only seeing, for example, some actions to the extent that these are relevant actions now, but this should have been there for the longest time already. We indeed, there's a degree by which uh, every action that is postponed eventually affects the ability of everyone to actually affect the trajectory of where we will go. The likely projections have always been there. The IPCC has made that clear. The UNFCCC has made that clear. So the knowledge is already there. What needs to be done would be to act. And everyone has to have that mindset already that it's not going to be someone else's responsibility, but it's the responsibility of everyone to act on it now in the best way that everyone think they can.
Thank you, Sir Rex. Dean Tony?
Yeah, I actually want to end always in these talks and in these panel discussions with a message of hope. I mean, Anjali knows that, having been my students. No? I mean, I actually have a virtual background for all my classes, and you can see it behind you, and that's why I chose it for that, because I wanted to end. That's a tree, but it's also the punilada, one of the um, birds that are threatened in the Philippines, and in fact in Luzon and the Sierra Madre, if I'm not mistaken. And there you see the law, the balance of the law as a way of change. No? Um, as I said at the beginning, I've been into this for 30 years. I mean, I've played different roles: an activist, a top government official, uh, a negotiator, an academic, an international lobbyist, a national lobbyist, an educator. Um, and I've seen the patterns of climate action, both the global, the domestic uh, processes. And what I'm saying is, we are now at the brink of a tremendous uh, period of climate action all over the world, globally speaking. Um, and there's several reasons for that. One is we have an upcoming IPCC report. Every IPCC report always leads to a lot of action in the last 30 years. You know, an IPCC report led to the convention. An IPCC report informed the Kyoto Protocol. An IPCC report allowed agreement in Marrakesh to implement the Kyoto Protocol. An IPCC report led to the Bali Action Plan, which is what finally led to the Paris Agreement, which was informed also by an IPCC report. And now we have a new IPCC report that's coming out this year and next year. And I mean, delayed obviously by the pandemic, but it's coming out. So there's gonna be, the IPCC report will tell us the extent of the problem, but it will tell us also where the solutions are, and scientifically. So we're not inventing things out of the blue, but we're actually guided by good science. No? And then the politics is converging, with the US going back in, with China now agreeing, not reluctantly anymore, to be a leader, because China, has always been in the past saying that yes, we will do it, but we will follow the US. When the US left, China became the top leader of the convention, and now they cannot say and go back, well, the US is back in, we're going back to number 2. No, you imagine that's a very, very big step in the climate change process, to have China and US are sort of the ones most responsible, the ones that will be there. Of course, EU you'll always have there. Japan, very big change in Japan from what it was even a year ago. No? I mean, so the politics are converging. The things on the ground in the Philippines are also converging. We see that. We see that in many places as well. But most of all, and that's why I'm addressing this to the climate leaders, the youth. We didn't have your voice in Paris. We didn't have your voice in, how I wish I had your voice in Kyoto. How I wish I had your voice in Marrakesh, in Bali, in Copenhagen. We didn't have your voice. Now we have your voice. So I'm actually very hopeful that within my lifetime, and I probably have just another 10 years, I'm 60 years old, so siguro naman, At 70, ayaw ko na siguro talaga magbiyahe, di ba? At 60, in the next 10 years, we can finally solve this and achieve the 1.5 target. And then I can be a tourist guide because that's what I want to do for the rest of my life, aside from teaching.
Thank you, Dean Tony and Sir Rex. That was very inspiring, and we learned so much from you guys. Thank you for giving us your time and your expertise. So before we go, Keith is just gonna share about our donation drive.
Yes, thank you, Angeli, and thank you to our speakers. Before we go, we just want to plug the last call for the donation drives for the victims of Typhoon Quinta, Typhoon Rolly, and Typhoon Ulysses. The Philippine branch and the ICSC will continue receiving your in-kind donations, preferably food and urgent supplies, until November 30, Monday, 10 o'clock a.m. to 2 p.m. We won't be able to accommodate used clothes and bedding items anymore unless they are new and may already be distributed to the communities. Please send or drop your donations to the addresses found on screen: the Climate Reality Project Philippines, Unit 706, FSS Building 2, Scout Tuazon Street, Quezon City; the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, 89B, Scout Dr. Lescano Street, Quezon City; and the Hertz office, Somerset Olympia Building, 7912, Makati Avenue, Makati City. For cash donations, please course them through the following channels flashed on the screen: GCash to Miss Cherry Gilias, 0917-813-1562, and PayMaya to Mary Ann Calma Santowalia, 0939-922-6933. Again, thank you very much to those who are contributing in any form or way possible. We will be posting the details of the donation drive at the end of this episode, and you may visit the social media pages of the Climate Reality Project Philippines for more information. Thank you also to our experts who gave their time and effort and a piece of their knowledge to us this evening, and to those who joined us in the Zoom room, the staff, and also those in the Facebook Live. Thank you very much to my co-host Angeli. Thank you very much also, and to all who are working with us.
Yes, thank you very much, Keith, and to the staff of the Philippine branch, Sir Toff, Sir Ian, Sir Francis, and of course, our branch manager, Miss Naz. And to the rest of the production team, Miss Amy, Sir Gab, and Miss Casey, and to everyone with us today, thank you very much. Again, Klimatotohanan is an avenue for us climate reality leaders to discuss issues on climate crises. That's why we once again invite everyone to join us in producing this webcast. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Couple.